Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and I'm so happy that we're here again together. Me recording this episode and you eventually listening to it. I must say, I am about 8 or 9 weeks ahead in my recording of these episodes than you are in hearing them. So right now I'm recording what will be episode 12. And by the time you hear it, I will likely be in the process of recording maybe episode 20. So it's interesting because I want to comment on things that are happening, but it feels a little weird too because you won't hear it for so long. For example, I recently published the first few episodes of Reading Michael Jackson. I think I have 5 episodes out right now. And I've been hearing such wonderful and kind and supportive feedback from many people who have listened. Both people I know, which is cool, as well as a lot of people I don't know. And I really appreciate that. It means a lot to me that people are resonating with things that I am sharing and saying and offering, because I'm just one person, one fan, reading and interpreting and giving my own perspective. I am no authority on any of this, no authority on Michael, and it's just nice to know that me putting myself kind of out there in my own expression and interpretation of these pieces is being so well received so far. So I just want to thank you all for listening and making me enjoy recording these even more than I already was before I had released any. Now that we have gotten through that somewhat unneeded introduction, let's get to the actual piece and back to Dancing the Dream, shall we? So we are right now on page 34 of Dancing the Dream. So we're not too far into it yet, but we are inching that way toward the halfway point, which is exciting. And we have today an essay, or you might even think of it as a short story, I don't know, called Mark of the Ancients. There's also a few photos that surround this piece that I would love to talk about. But first, I'd like to read the piece, discuss the piece, and then, if there's time, leave some room to discuss the photography as well, because it's all part of the Dancing the Dream journey. So with that said, let us begin with Mark of the Ancients. Mark of the Ancients. He had lived in the desert all his life, but for me it was all new. "See that footprint in the sand?" he asked, pointing to a spot by the cliff. I looked as close as I could. "No, I don't see anything." "That's just the point," he laughed. "Where you can't see a print, that's where the ancient ones walked." We went on a little farther, and he pointed to an opening high up on the sandstone wall. "See that house up there?" he asked. I squinted hard. "There's nothing to see." "You're a good student," he smiled. "Where there's no roof or chimney, that's where the ancient ones are most likely to have lived." We rounded a bend, and before us was spread a fabulous sight. Thousands upon thousands of desert flowers in bloom. "Can you see any missing?" he asked me. I shook my head. "It's just wave after wave of loveliness." "Yes," he said in a low voice. "Where nothing is missing, that's where the ancient ones harvested the most." I thought about all of this, about how generations once lived in harmony with the earth, leaving no marks to scar the places they inhabited. At camp that night, I said, "You left out one thing, "What's that?" he asked. "Where are the ancient ones buried?" Without reply, he poked his stick into the fire. A bright flame shot up, licked the air, and disappeared. My teacher gave me a glance to ask if I understood this lesson. I sat very still, and my silence told him I did. I must admit that coming off of reading this piece, I had to sit with it a bit. My mind is sort of swirling. I have a lot of ideas right now, and trying to articulate them can be a challenge sometimes. A couple of episodes ago, I talked about how Michael writes in this sort of style, and I couldn't pinpoint the word. I said something like fable, which was not right. I think the word I was looking for was a parable. Michael writes as if he is writing a parable for us to read and sit with and contemplate. As a writer myself, and as a professor of writing, I like to wonder about audience. I am of the mind that even many of us, when we are writing in our diary or our journal, we have a kind of imagined audience in mind. It could be, an ultra compassionate audience or one that is always on our side. It could also be our harshest critic or our greatest friend, but we're still writing toward an audience. All writing, in some way, is seeking an audience. Even the writing we write for ourselves. Sometimes we are the audience. But needless to say, I mention this because when I read some of Michael's pieces, I do wonder, who is his audience? I would love to know when, in his busy, busy life, when was Michael Jackson sitting down and writing a short story like this about himself or someone else, a fictional narrator, however you want to interpret it, having this conversation about the ancients. When was he doing this? We know it was published in 1992, so it could have been any time in his life leading up to that point. When was he doing this? Did he imagine these pieces being read? Did he have a message he sat down to explore in his writing? Or did it just come out this way? I'm so curious about his writing process, but mostly I really want to know why he wrote this. Was he exploring something within himself, in his own beliefs? Was he trying to make sense of something of his own? Or was he trying to write in the form of a parable, in the means of translating some kind of a lesson for the people who would ultimately read it? I just wonder, because all of that is related to his writing process, but also his purpose and his intent. And I want to understand it. I do. I want to understand it, and I wish I could have a conversation with him about it. But I suppose I am right now in my own way. Before I get into discussing my take on the piece, I want to recap what the scenario is that we see here. I was struck between calling this an essay and a short story because it is written from the I perspective, and it could easily be a retelling of his own experience. For example, I had the thought, Michael traveled the world, and during his travels would occasionally, step out into the world and visit historical places. He would go to museums, he would go to natural sites, historical monuments, and places of significance. So on some level, I could see this once again being inspired by something real, not necessarily a real conversation, but a real scenario. However, I also thought there's something fictional about this. He creates this scenario where we have a kind of a teacher and a student walking through a landscape and taking inventory of it. And so there's, of course, that lesson, that parable kind of model. Either way, I think there's a few different ways to read this piece. One of the most immediate ways that I would read it is from the sort of environmental, social end, where we might think about the message of this story. This idea of you may have heard the term the campsite rule, where you leave things in the condition or the state that you found them, if not better. He talks about throughout this piece, well, there's no sign of their footprints. There's no sign of the architecture or the places they lived. There's no sign of the things they took from the earth. There's no depletion. There's no suffering in their wake. There's nothing. There's no physical evidence at all. Because it's Michael, I thought first about this from an environmentalist perspective, offering some commentary on the ways in which humans leave their mark for the worse. You leave behind ashes, so to speak. Just think about in our beautiful earth the many, many examples of this, the mass of plastics and microplastics in the ocean that are like its own island. Anywhere you go, you can see, or at least in America, anywhere you go, you can see litter everywhere. The constant mark that human beings have been here and have not taken the care to clean up. You think about the world as a whole and the way human beings will die and disintegrate, and the plastics that we use will still be here. Things like that. I think about that and again, in part I think of that because it's Michael, and I know he cared a great deal about the environment, but I also think about it because he's talking about this idea of you can take from this lush land and make no impact that will harm it. You can take without depleting. You can take without exploiting, so that the more you harvest, the more will grow, because you are facilitating that growth. There's a symbiotic relationship between the human and the earth that can be the ideal that we strive for, and perhaps should be the ideal we strive for. But then, on the other side, outside of this environmental kind of reading, I also read this in a more spiritual way, or more about energy, or about legacy. For example, we're referring to this group as, quote unquote, the ancients. Who is this group of people? I don't know. But we're talking about the ancients, those who came before us, and looking for signs of them everywhere. And we can't find them. And yet, even without the physical evidence of their existence, we can feel them, because their energy is still here, because their legacy has been cemented enough that we are there in the landscape seeking evidence of their one-time existence. And you can say this about anything. It could be a symbol, or all of this could be a metaphor for the impact we individually make on the world, where maybe we don't make a physical impact in the way that we might expect, but we stay alive in the hearts and in the spirits of those around us on a more metaphysical level or an energetic level. We feed back into the energy of the world around us, rather than simply going into the ground and staying there. And this is kind of referenced toward the end when he asks about where are their graves, and they look to the fire and see the spark of flames, and that's the answer. They're kind of back in the atmosphere. They're back of the earth. I really like both readings of this, honestly. I like thinking about the human responsibility to the earth, to the environment, toward those around us, to resist exploitation, and the idea that there can be enough for everyone. I think we live in a world where we often encourage people to just do what's best for them without really thinking about what that even means. Is it best for a person to take everything? I don't think so. I think that there's that commentary that's useful, but I really do like this spiritual commentary, or the way that I'm reading it, of course, the spiritual commentary, or the commentary on legacy, because I think it's clear Michael did care a great deal about legacy and about being felt in some way beyond his own time on Earth. And I mean, here we are, 15 years after his death, and someone who became a fan 3 years ago is running a podcast about his book of poetry, So, I mean, talk about legacy. Still, I think this idea that the presence of those who came before us, in whatever form, can be felt and hold influence, even when it's not seen, even when they are not visible. I think that's something most of us would agree with, even just in our own personal lives. But certainly, if you think about those individuals who have left such a significant mark on the world as Michael Jackson did. And I suppose this brings me to discussing the portraits and the artwork that are featured around this piece in Dancing the Dream. I hoped I would have time, and we are running a little over, but I still would like to share a few thoughts on this. In Dancing the Dream, next to this piece, there's a photo of Michael in which he's dressed, I would say almost like an ancient Roman soldier or something. On the flip side of that, there are two photos of him. One in which he is dressed almost like a Napoleon sort of style, and another when he is dressed and adorned as a king sitting in a throne. And when I first became a fan of Michael, I kind of struggled with these photographs because I didn't really understand them. They felt in some way incongruent with the very humble man that I had grown to admire. So many people made note of Michael's humility in terms of his talent, in terms of how he treated others. He was very gracious, very patient, very kind, did not seem to have a massive ego by any means. However, as a new fan, I looked at these photos and was a bit confused by them. I mean, there's a lot I can say about that, right? There's, of course, a person is not their image. And Michael being, an icon and a pop star and, a world famous person, of course he had an image that he was creating and that he had to uphold. And I see that as separate from an individual. I don't fault anyone for that. There's the performer and the famous person, and that identity, and then there is the human and individual identity. But some part of it still just didn't align or make sense to me. But as I got to know Michael more through my research about him, listening to many countless interviews, reading books about him, I started to understand him differently and his reasoning for this differently. On one hand, there's the fact that he was someone who clearly believed in manifesting his destiny, of kind of creating a reality for himself and cementing himself in history. I mean, that's evident in many ways. It's evident in his song History, the lyrics discussing, marking your place in history, and every day you're writing your own legacy. But then there's also examples of him literally writing affirmations one in which he talks about it being time for a black king, to help kind of mend racial inequality and bring the races together so everyone, white and black, could have a figure to admire, a king-like figure. And he was sort of creating himself as that, with the goal of racial unity always there in the forefront. And I see those things and I think, okay, so part of this creating yourself in this image, that is in part because you are trying to kind of cement that manifestation into being. But I also thought about how when you look back through history at great historical figures, great thinkers, inventors, musicians, artists, there are portraits, there are formal portraits of them. And we don't know, what their everyday attire was. We don't know really who they were outside of what was left behind of them, which includes their work and the historical documents about them, as well as these portraits of them. And I think on some level, when he was creating this image of himself and he was commissioning these types of portraits, on some level, I think he was establishing himself as being one of those memorable and remembered figures from history. I can't help but wonder if part of that comes from an inability to completely control the narrative that was built up around him at that time. So while in his heyday, he was, of course, very appreciated musically, he was also very attacked and ridiculed in the media, in general society. But he created these images of himself that would linger beyond his timeline. And they would make a statement to the world about who he was, well beyond living in the context of that time. And I can tell you, as a person who became a fan in the 2020s, well after his death, I can tell you that the difference in becoming a fan then and the exposure I had to him in the 2000s when I was a teenager, it's significantly different. I've mentioned in a previous episode, I really couldn't see him clearly before because my view was so muddied by the media's portrayal of him. There was no way to really know who he was. But now I was able to come to him sort of in my own way, with my own perspective, less influenced by the culture and the media of that time. It's the same now for young people who are coming to him and discovering his music. They lack the context of the greater media and culture that ridiculed him. So now what most remains are the highlights of his career, the iconography that he had established while he was alive and thriving in his career. And with that, I see one of these portraits, which is a portrait of him in a throne looking like a king. I see this portrait frequently on social media, especially as people reference his ownership of the music industry and his inability to be surpassed. And it has now become a commonly used photo to represent him as a quote-unquote king of music, king of entertainment, king of pop, of course. And I think about the intentionality of that and how the noise around him continues to fall away as the years pass since his death. Of course, we've had controversies and things since then, but for the average person, his legacy of what he created is what people hold on to. And as the noise falls away and the culture evolves, we will continue to have his legacy of what he created, including the portraits. And all of that is meant to say that I believe he was very forward thinking in the way he established himself as an artist. I don't think it comes from an arrogance or an ego that he had these portraits commissioned. It's not because I even have a problem imagining that maybe his ego did enjoy it, But it's because so much of what Michael did seemed to be very intentional and very planned. I get a sense from him, the more I study him, that he was always 10 steps ahead in his own mind. He always had a plan of how things would come together eventually when the time was right. And I believe that was the forward thinking here. And to bring this back to the episode content of this piece about the ancients, I believe that's part of his fascination with the past, his fascination with the military, his fascination with the royalty of the past, especially the imagery of royalty, the military jackets he wore. There's something regal and classic about these things that elevate his status when he appears that way. There's this fascination there, but that is continuing to translate into something powerful, in some cases 40 years after he first adorned himself in this sort of ensemble. So with this Mark of the Ancients essay, coupled with these photos that he placed around it, I believe he is trying to say something about our individual relationship to legacy, our individual relationship to the world around us, and mostly trying to communicate something about his own perspective there. And perhaps trying to communicate something about his own philosophy there. I know this was a bit of a meandering episode at times, so I appreciate your patience. I had so many thoughts about this piece, and I continue to have thoughts about it. I continuously am interested in where these ideas come from for him, what made him sit down and write them, and why he decided to publish them in the way that he did, surrounded by the photographs that he did. So again, from one fan to hopefully many others, I'm grateful that you give me the space to explore my own perspective and my own curiosity about Michael as well as his legacy and his work. And I hope that it gets you to think about him in this way as well. So thank you once again for joining me, and I very much look forward to continuing this journey with you again next week.